The sunset painted the cemetery in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across weathered tombstones. Every evening, as darkness crept between the graves, Thomas would watch the old woman arrive. Her frail figure moved with purpose, stopping at random graves, whispering to strangers as if they were old friends. For 3 years as gravedigger, he'd observed her ritual, never understanding why she spoke to those she couldn't have known. Tonight, something in her hushed tone seemed different, more urgent. Thomas set down his shovel, the metal striking stone with an ominous ring. He would follow her home. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Thomas discovers the old woman's secret. Thomas hadn't always been a gravedigger. Once, he'd been a promising theology student with dreams of guiding a congregation through life's spiritual journey. But that was before the accident, before he'd fallen asleep at the wheel driving home from a late-night study session, before his younger sister Emma had paid the ultimate price for his momentary lapse. The funeral had been small, and though everyone said it wasn't his fault, Thomas knew better. God knew better. Now, at 34, he found solace in preparing final resting places for others. The irony wasn't lost on him. Unable to face the living and their judgment, he found peace among the dead. They never asked questions, never looked at him with that mixture of pity and unspoken blame he'd seen in his parents' eyes before they'd stopped looking at him altogether. Thomas wanted something simple, forgiveness. Not from others, but from himself. Each grave he dug was a form of penance. Each body laid to rest a prayer for Emma's peaceful slumber. The cemetery director, Mr. Hargrove, had never approved of Thomas's employment. A man with old money and older prejudices, Hargrove had made it clear that Thomas was merely tolerated, not accepted. Grave digging is for those who can't do better, he once remarked within Thomas's earshot. Those who failed at life's proper callings. That afternoon, before the old woman's arrival, Hargrove had brought potential investors through the cemetery. When they'd encountered Thomas, dirt-covered and sweating over a fresh grave, Hargrove had seized the opportunity. "This is what happens when you waste your potential," he'd announced, gesturing toward Thomas as if he were an exhibit. "Our digger here was once bound for the clergy, I'm told. Now he communes with the dead instead of the divine. A cautionary tale, gentlemen." The investors had chuckled uncomfortably while Thomas stood frozen, shovel in hand, shame burning through him like fire. It was the public confirmation of what he'd always suspected, that his fall from grace was complete, his redemption impossible. Perhaps that's why the old woman's whispered conversations with the dead intrigued him so. In her, he sensed a similar wound, a kindred spirit seeking connection where the living had failed her. The old woman disappeared around a bend in the cemetery path, and Thomas followed at a distance, careful to keep his footsteps quiet on the gravel. As he rounded the corner, he nearly collided with Mr. Hargrove, who stood with arms crossed, moonlight glinting off his silver cufflinks. "Abandoning your duties to stalk our patrons, Thomas?" Hargrove's voice cut through the evening stillness. "I've been watching you watching her. Rather inappropriate, wouldn't you say?" Thomas stepped back, heat rising to his face. I was just concerned about an elderly visitor being alone after dark." "How noble," Hargrove sneered. The failed priest still trying to save souls. He gestured toward Thomas's dirt-stained clothes. "Look at yourself. You can't even maintain basic professional standards. Return to the north section and finish what you started, or don't bother coming back tomorrow." As the old woman vanished into the gathering darkness, Thomas trudged back to his abandoned shovel, the weight of Hargrove's contempt heavier than any coffin he'd ever lowered. The following evening, Thomas arrived early, determined to complete his work before the old woman's appearance. He was smoothing the soil over a fresh grave when he heard Hargrove's voice carrying across the cemetery, unnaturally loud, as if ensuring an audience. "Mrs. Blackwood, I must apologize for our gravedigger's behavior yesterday," Hargrove announced, steering an elegant older woman, clearly a substantial donor, directly toward Thomas. He was observed following one of our elderly visitors. Most disturbing. Thomas straightened, soil falling from his gloves. Mrs. Blackwood regarded him with undisguised revulsion. "Is this him? The one with the history?" she asked, not bothering to lower her voice. "Indeed," Hargrove confirmed. "The seminary dropout responsible for his sister's death. We employ him out of charity, though incidents like yesterday's make me question my generosity." Thomas stood paralyzed, his most private shame laid bare before a stranger. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed with judgment, and Thomas felt himself diminishing under her gaze. becoming as invisible as the bodies he buried. "Perhaps reconsider your charitable inclinations, Mr. Hargrove," she said coldly. "Some souls are beyond redemption." The third humiliation came 3 days later. Thomas had spotted the mysterious old woman again and had decided to approach her directly, respectfully. But as he neared, Hargrove intercepted him, this time accompanied by 2 cemetery board members and, to Thomas's horror, his own parents, whom he hadn't seen in 5 years. "Your son was about to accost another elderly visitor," Hargrove informed them with performative concern. "It's become a pattern of increasingly disturbing behavior." Thomas's father wouldn't meet his eyes. His mother's face was a mask of disappointment. "We received your letter about his conduct, Mr. Hargrove," his father said stiffly. "We had hoped, but clearly Thomas hasn't changed." "I never sent any letter," Thomas protested, but Hargrove smoothly produced an envelope. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been following this particular woman? Or shall I share my theories with your parents?" In that moment, with his family, his employer, and the board members all staring at him with varying degrees of disgust, Thomas felt something break inside him, and then reform stronger. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn leather journal. The board members exchanged confused glances as Thomas opened it, revealing pages of meticulous handwriting, dates, times, and names. "For 3 years," Thomas said quietly, "I've documented every visitor to this cemetery, every pattern, every anomaly." He turned to a specific page, including Mr. Hargrove's habit of selling and used plots multiple times to different families. The color drained from Hargrove's face as Thomas continued, his voice steady, his theological training evident in his measured, articulate delivery, a glimpse of the man he once was and perhaps could be again. Among the stunned faces, Bishop Montgomery stood silently at the edge of the gathering. His weathered eyes narrowed as he observed the confrontation. "Enough," he finally said, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Hargrove, my office." Now, Thomas stood in the cemetery's administrative building, his worn leather journal open on the polished mahogany table. The room had fallen into a tense silence after his revelation. Bishop Montgomery had escorted Hargrove away, leaving Thomas with the board members and his parents, who now regarded him with uncertain expressions that mixed lingering doubt with dawning realization. "May I?" One of the board members, Mrs. Winters, reached for the journal. Thomas nodded, watching as she flipped through pages of his meticulous documentation. For 3 years, he had recorded everything, not out of obsession, but from a deep-seated need to create order from chaos, to find patterns where others saw only randomness. It was the same quality that had once made him an exceptional seminary student before tragedy derailed his path. "These records are extraordinary," Mrs. Winters murmured. "Dates, times, plot numbers, discrepancies, and burial records." Thomas's father stepped forward hesitantly. "You've been keeping track of all this?" "Why?" "Because no one else was watching," Thomas replied simply. "And the dead deserve someone to witness for them." He turned to a specific page and pointed to a series of entries. "These are the plots Hargrove sold twice. And these," he flipped to another section, "are the maintenance fees collected for services never performed." The second board member, Mr. Daniels, leaned forward. "How did you know to look for this?" Thomas closed his eyes briefly, remembering. It started with the flowers. Fresh bouquets would disappear from certain graves within hours, only to reappear on premium plots when potential buyers were touring. Small things at first, but patterns emerged. His mother touched his arm tentatively. "Thomas, we didn't know." "No one did," he said. That was the point. The door opened, and Bishop Montgomery returned alone, his face grave. "Mr. Hargrove has been temporarily relieved of his duties, pending a full investigation." He turned to Thomas. "Would you be willing to share your complete records with our auditors?" Thomas nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "The woman, the elderly visitor I've been watching, she's still here. I need to speak with her." "Thomas, perhaps now isn't the time," his father began. "It's exactly the time," Thomas insisted. "She's connected to this somehow. I'm certain of it." Bishop Montgomery studied Thomas for a long moment. "Go," he said finally. "We'll continue this discussion later." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds. Thomas moved with purpose, knowing exactly where to find her. For weeks, he had observed her pattern, always at sunset, always visiting the same forgotten graves in the oldest section of the cemetery. He found her kneeling before a weathered headstone, her silver hair catching the golden light. As he approached, she spoke without turning. I wondered when you would finally come speak to me, instead of watching from a distance. Thomas stopped, surprised. You knew I was following you? She turned then, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and clear. Of course. You're not as invisible as you think, Thomas Mercer. The use of his full name startled him. How do you know who I am? I know many things. She patted the ground beside her. Sit. It's time we talk properly. Thomas hesitated, then lowered himself to the grass. Up close, he could see the headstone bore the name Eleanor Hargrove, 1902 to 1943. You're related to Mr. Hargrove, he said, understanding dawning. His grandmother. She smiled slightly, though he doesn't know I visit. Family estrangement is something of a tradition for us Hargroves. Why these graves? Thomas asked, gesturing to the row of modest markers she visited regularly. None of them share your name. No, she agreed. But they share something more important. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a faded photograph. These were the children from St. Agnes Orphanage. They died in the fire of 1938. Thomas took the photograph carefully. It showed a group of children standing before a brick building, their faces solemn. I was a nurse there, she continued. The only staff member who survived. The official report claimed faulty wiring, but it wasn't true. What happened? Thomas asked quietly. The orphanage stood on valuable land. My husband, Richard's grandfather, wanted to develop it. When the orphanage refused to sell, her voice faltered. 27 children died. No families to mourn them. No one to remember. Except you, Thomas said. And now you. She looked at him intently. You understand the sacred duty of remembering, don't you? That's why you keep your journal. That's why you notice things others miss. Thomas felt a chill. How do you know about my journal? I've been watching you too, Thomas. I've seen you recording, observing. When I realized who you were, what you were doing, I knew you were the one I've been waiting for. Waiting for what? She reached into her bag again and withdrew a small leather-bound book much older than Thomas's journal. To pass this on, the complete record of what happened at St. Agnes and what the Hargrove family has been hiding for generations. Thomas stared at the book. Why me? Because you understand that some truths must be preserved, even when buried. Because you've experienced how powerful men can rewrite history. She pressed the book into his hands. And because you're already seeking redemption for your own buried truths. Thomas flinched. You know about my sister. I know you blame yourself for her death. I know you left the seminary because you couldn't reconcile a loving God with your loss. Her voice softened. And I know it wasn't your fault, Thomas. Tears pricked at his eyes. You can't know that, can I? She smiled sadly. We recognize our own kind, those of us who carry burdens that aren't truly ours to bear. From the direction of the administrative building, voices approached. Thomas glanced back to see Hargrove striding toward them, his face contorted with rage, Bishop Montgomery following at a distance. You need to go, Thomas told the woman urgently. No, she said calmly. This confrontation is long overdue. Hargrove reached them, pointing an accusatory finger. You? I told you to stay away from the cemetery. The old woman rose slowly to her feet, dignity in every movement. Hello, Richard. Your grandmother has come to call. Hargrove's face paled. That's impossible. My grandmother died before I was born. Did I? She smiled thinly. Is that what your father told you? How convenient for him to erase the family member who knew all his secrets. This is absurd, Hargrove sputtered, turning to Thomas. You've concocted this ridiculous scheme with this delusional woman to discredit me. Thomas stood, clutching both journals. Everything I've documented is true, and I suspect her records will confirm it. Records? Hargrove's eyes darted to the old book. What records? The truth about St. Agnes Orphanage, the woman said. About the fire. About the land deals that followed. About how the Hargrove fortune was built on the ashes of 27 children. Bishop Montgomery had reached them now, his expression grave as he listened. This is slander, Hargrove hissed. I'll have you both removed from. That's enough, Richard, Bishop Montgomery interrupted quietly. I think it's time we all had a very honest conversation about the history of this cemetery and your family's involvement with it. Hargrove's face twisted. You can't possibly believe these accusations. This man is mentally unstable, and this woman is clearly an imposter. Perhaps, the bishop said, but their evidence deserves examination. He turned to Thomas. Mr. Mercer, would you and your companion join me in my office? I believe we have much to discuss. As they walked away, Thomas felt the weight of both journals in his hands, the burden of truth, but also its power. Behind them, Hargrove stood frozen among the graves, his carefully constructed reality crumbling around him. You've done well, the old woman whispered. The dead have waited a long time for someone to speak for them. Thomas nodded, feeling something shift within him. Not redemption, not yet, but perhaps it's beginning. Thank you for trusting me with this. We're just getting started, she said, her eyes bright with purpose. There are more truths to uncover, more stories that need telling. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the stirring of his old calling, not to preach, but to bear witness, to speak truth, to remember. It was, in its way, a kind of ministry after all. What's your story? I'd love to know where you're watching from. Comment below, and let me know what part of the world you're experiencing this tale from. The meeting was interrupted by a deafening explosion. Through the window, flames engulfed the cemetery's records building. Thomas spotted a shadowy figure fleeing the scene, someone desperate to destroy evidence that could implicate more than just the Hargrove family in decades of buried crimes. The flames licked hungrily at the night sky as Thomas, the old woman, and Bishop Montgomery stood frozen in horror. The cemetery's records building, a small brick structure that had stood for over a century, was being devoured before their eyes. No, Thomas shouted, instinctively moving toward the blaze. The old woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength. The journals, she said urgently. Protect them first. Bishop Montgomery was already on his phone, calling emergency services. Fire at Oakwood Cemetery, he reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. The records building. Yes, immediately. Thomas clutched both journals to his chest, his mind racing. The shadowy figure he'd glimpsed disappearing into the darkness. It had to be Hargrove or someone working for him. The timing was too perfect, the target too specific. He's destroying evidence, Thomas said grimly. Not all of it, the old woman replied, patting her own journal. And not what's in here. She tapped her temple. Some memories can't be burned away. As sirens wailed in the distance, Thomas made a decision. We need to secure these somewhere safe, then find Hargrove before he destroys anything else. My office, Bishop Montgomery offered, rejoining them. There's a safe. We can lock them away while we deal with this. They hurried across the cemetery grounds, the orange glow of the fire casting long, dancing shadows among the headstones. Thomas couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment, as if the dead themselves were watching, waiting to see if justice would finally come. In the bishop's office, Montgomery worked the combination on an old floor safe hidden behind a painting of St. Michael. Appropriate guardian, the old woman murmured, nodding at the archangel depicted vanquishing evil. With the journal secured, Thomas turned to his companions. Hargrove will be covering his tracks. The orphanage records, property deeds, anything that could connect his family to what happened. The county records office, Bishop Montgomery said. If he's thorough, that's where he'll go next. Then so will we, Thomas replied. But we need proof of what he's doing. We need to catch him in the act. The old woman's eyes gleamed with determination. I have an idea. 20 minutes later, they were parked across from the county records building, a stately stone structure in the heart of downtown. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, but a single black luxury car sat in the otherwise vacant parking lot. That's Hargrove's car, Bishop Montgomery confirmed. He's inside. Thomas checked his phone. The police should be here in 10 minutes. I told them we suspected arson at the cemetery and believed the perpetrator was now targeting county records. He'll be in the basement archives, the old woman said. That's where they keep the historical property records and court documents. Thomas nodded. We need to stall him until the police arrive. And if he has a weapon, Bishop Montgomery asked quietly. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't considered that possibility. Then we stay back, but we make sure he doesn't leave. They approached the building cautiously. The front door was ajar. Hargrove had either used his influence to gain access or force his way in. Either way, it spoke to his desperation. Inside, the building was dimly lit by emergency lights. They moved silently through the marble-floored lobby toward the stairwell leading down to the archives. "I'll go first," Thomas whispered. "Bishop, you stay near the entrance to make sure he doesn't slip past us. If the police arrive, direct them down." "And me?" the old woman asked. Thomas looked at her with concern. "Perhaps you should. I've waited 60 years to confront my son's lies," she interrupted firmly. "I'm coming with you." Thomas couldn't argue with the steel in her voice. They descended the stairs together, the old woman's hand resting lightly on his arm for balance. The basement archives were a labyrinth of metal shelving units filled with bound volumes, file boxes, and document cases. The air smelled of old paper and dust. From somewhere deep within, they heard the sound of papers being shuffled and occasionally torn. Thomas and the old woman followed the noise, moving cautiously between the shelves. They found Hargrove in the far corner, frantically rifling through a drawer of property deeds. A small pile of papers lay on the floor beside him, and in his other hand, he clutched a lighter. "It won't work, Richard," the old woman said clearly, her voice echoing in the quiet space. Hargrove spun around, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You," he spat. "You're supposed to be dead. Your father tried to make that happen," she replied calmly. "He failed, just as you're failing now." Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of the old woman. "The police are on their way, Hargrove. They already know about the fire at the cemetery." "You understand nothing," Hargrove snarled, waving the lighter threateningly. "This isn't just about my family. There are powerful people in this town whose fortunes were built on that land deal. Judges, politicians, church leaders. All the more reason for the truth to come out," Thomas said. Hargrove laughed bitterly. "Truth? You want truth? The truth is that no one cares about 27 orphans who died 60 years ago. No one except a failed priest and a crazy old woman. I care," came Bishop Montgomery's voice as he emerged from between the shelves. "And so will everyone else when they learn what happened." Hargrove's eyes darted between the three of them, calculating. Then, with sudden decision, he flicked the lighter and held the flame to the papers in his hand. Thomas lunged forward without thinking, knocking into Hargrove. The lighter and papers went flying in opposite directions. The two men crashed into a shelving unit, sending boxes tumbling around them. Hargrove was stronger than he looked. He shoved Thomas back and scrambled for the lighter, which had skittered across the floor. "Stop him," Thomas shouted. But it was the old woman who moved fastest. She stepped directly into Hargrove's path, her frail body the only barrier between him and escape. "Get out of my way," he growled. "I should have stopped your father," she said quietly. "I won't fail twice." Hargrove raised his hand as if to strike her, and Thomas felt a surge of protective fury. But before either man could move, the sound of multiple footsteps thundered down the stairwell. "Police, don't move." Hargrove froze, his face a mask of hatred. For one terrible moment, Thomas thought he might still lash out at the old woman. Instead, he straightened his jacket and adopted an expression of affronted dignity. "Officers, I'm Richard Hargrove. There's been a misunderstanding. These people broke in and—" "Save it," said the lead officer, a stern-faced woman. "We've got reports of arson at the cemetery connected to this location. Everyone's coming down to the station." As the police led them all upstairs, Thomas found himself walking beside the old woman. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, her eyes fixed on Hargrove's back. "For the first time in decades," she whispered, "I think I might be." The next morning dawned with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, as if the universe itself wanted to illuminate the truth that had been buried for so long. Thomas sat in the police station's waiting area, watching sunlight stream through dusty blinds while officers moved purposefully around him. Bishop Montgomery approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "They've been questioning Hargrove for hours," he said, handing one to Thomas. "The evidence they found in those files is substantial." Thomas nodded, warming his hands around the cup. "Have you seen her?" "Mrs. Abernathy. She's giving her statement." Remarkable woman. The station door swung open, and Thomas recognized the town's mayor entering with a grim expression, followed by 2 men in expensive suits. They were escorted immediately to a private office. "The power structure circling the wagons," Bishop Montgomery murmured. An hour later, Mrs. Abernathy emerged from an interview room, looking tired but somehow lighter. She sat beside Thomas, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I've waited 60 years to tell that story, she said quietly. To have someone actually listen. Before Thomas could respond, the door to the chief's office opened. Richard Hargrove walked out, flanked by the mayor and what appeared to be attorneys. His face was ashen, his previous arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed resignation. The police chief followed, her expression unreadable as she approached their small group. Mrs. Abernathy, she said formally, I want to personally thank you for your testimony. The district attorney will be filing charges against Mr. Hargrove for arson, obstruction of justice, and as an accessory after the fact in the cover-up of the 1963 incident. Cover-up? Thomas asked. What about the deaths themselves? The chief's jaw tightened. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations has expired for most potential charges related to the original incident. And Richard Hargrove wasn't directly involved. He was just a child then. His father was responsible, Mrs. Abernathy said, along with the town council and the church board at the time. All deceased now, the chief acknowledged. But we're reopening the investigation into the orphanage fire. Those children deserve to have the records set straight, even if perfect justice is no longer possible. Across the room, the mayor approached Hargrove's group. Though they spoke in hushed tones, their voices carried in the quiet station. The council has voted unanimously, the mayor was saying. You'll need to step down from all civic positions immediately. The family foundation's assets will be placed in trust pending investigation. This is absurd, Hargrove hissed. My father built this town, and apparently buried its darkest secret, the mayor replied. The memorial land will be returned to its original purpose. We can't undo the past, Richard, but we can stop perpetuating the lie. Hargrove's face contorted with fury, then collapsed into something like despair. You're destroying my family's legacy. Your father did that himself the night he chose profit over those children's lives. As Hargrove was led away, Mrs. Abernathy stood. For a moment, Thomas thought she might approach him, but instead, she walked to the station window, gazing out at the town below. It's not enough, Thomas said, joining her. Not after everything that happened. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's something. Those children will be remembered now. Their graves will be honored. The morning light caught the tears on her cheeks, transforming them into something almost luminous. I told them I would be their voice, she whispered. I promised I wouldn't forget. And now, neither will anyone else. Thomas placed his hand gently on her shoulder, understanding finally that some wounds never fully heal, but in the light of truth, they might at last begin to close. 3 months later, Thomas returned to his daily routine at the cemetery, though everything had changed. The old orphanage grounds had been properly consecrated, with individual markers replacing the unmarked mass grave. Each evening at sunset, he would see visitors leaving flowers, townspeople acknowledging a truth hidden for generations. The Hargrove estate had been converted into a memorial and community center. Richard Hargrove had pled guilty to lesser charges, avoiding prison but losing everything his family had built on secrecy and shame. Mrs. Abernathy still came every Tuesday and Friday, but now she brought others, elderly residents who remembered, younger ones who wanted to learn. Thomas would watch from a respectful distance as she told their stories, keeping her promise to those forgotten children. Today, as Thomas finished his shift, he noticed a weathered journal on his workbench. Inside was a note in Mrs. Abernathy's handwriting. There were others, other towns, other secrets. This belonged to Sister Margaret. She documented everything. Flipping through the yellowed pages, Thomas felt a chill. Detailed accounts of orphanages across 3 states, names of powerful families, coordinates of unmarked graves. On the final page, a list of towns with dates beside them. The last entry, circled in faded red ink, was a place called Mill Haven, just 50 miles north. Some secrets were never meant to stay buried. If you found this story moving, please subscribe and like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever uncovered a long-hidden truth